So, I'd like to preface this video with the fact that I love Sea of Thieves. There isn't another game on the market that's anywhere close to it in terms of its core gameplay loop or its variety of ways to interact with people you meet on the servers. I've invested, at the time of writing, 1,745 hours into the game, and have done practically everything the game has to offer at one level or another, from bloodthirsty, on-demand PvP through the Hourglass mode to getting distinctions multiple times over in every single trading company or faction in the game. So, I would say that, although there are people who have played for longer and done more than I have, I am by no means an inexperienced player. However, the future of the game, as it stands now, could not be more bleak, and common arguments against the continual decline of the game given by community leaders and representatives fall flat on their face when taking an objective view of what the game has done, what it's doing, and where it's going. To put it simply, the updates for Sea of Thieves for the past year have been consistently received as underwhelming, riddled with bugs on launch, and running contrary to popular community demands and requests, even at Rare's own admission, as they have admitted recently that they don't have a good track record in listening to their community. Seasonal content often has a very short window of popularity with the community at large, and is often, and rightly, criticized as dead on arrival or dying 2 or 3 weeks after being released. Going back to the launch of Season 12 in January of last year brought with it the implementation of 3 new weapons and tools: the throwing knives, the double-barrel pistol, and the bone collar, marking the first major change to player loadouts since the release of the Blunderbomb in 2020. When released, the throwing knives and double-barrel pistol were both buggy, often missing shots that should have hit and hitting shots that should have missed. These weapons, intended to change the way the players fought each other and CPU enemies in the world, flopped, as the dominant meta of the game has not changed, despite adding weapons to the armory. Though the knives are a useful addition to fighting PvE enemies, they are good for very little else, and the double-barrel pistol is seen more as a joke weapon today, as it is inaccurate, still buggy, and worse at its job than its single-barrel big brother, effectively being abandoned. The bone collar, a bomb that summons PvE skeletons wherever you throw it, is still actively used, but likely to be nerfed due to outrage from prominent streamers and community figures. Out of the 3 major additions for the season, one is situationally useful, one is useless, and one is controversial. The launch of Season 13 in July of last year brought the introduction of the Burning Blade World Event, the first new world event for players to interact with in years, and at this time, the most recent world event in the game, bringing with it the biggest gold and XP exploit the game has ever seen, making it possible for players to skyrocket through the progression of the game. Rare did fix this in a patchwork way, only taking away the levels of some of the worst offenders, but leaving the majority unharmed, a theme that is consistent with their roughshod implementation of bug fixes and content. Logging onto the servers today, the Burning Blade World event, when it does spawn, as it spawns at a lower rate compared to every other world event in the game, is often left entirely alone, as it boils down to sailing from point to point on the slowest ship in the game, doing the same activity over and over, hoping you don't get attacked, as fighting with the Burning Blade is incredibly easy as an outside player and almost impossible to consistently defend as the crew, as outside players, even if you sink them, can just keep coming back. And I should know, I've sunk almost 120 of them. This model of content being effectively dead after initial hype period continues with seasons in the future, and is compounded by some seasonal content being almost entirely useless due to poor implementation. Season 14 saw the implementation of crouching, disguising as a chest, bear traps, the harpoon gun, and the blowpipe weapon. Season 14's launch was one of the worst seen in the history of the game, with many features being significantly delayed or introduced in a buggy state to be pulled later. Out of the main features introduced in Season 14, crouching is slow and obtuse, barely usable outside of sneaking around on enemy ships, in which case you're better off walking or running to get into a better hiding spot faster. In addition, crouching came with a bug that made the player invincible. Chest disguises are ineffectual and extremely situational, as they make you move incredibly slowly and expose you immediately as as soon as someone tries to interact with you, which they will, as you're disguised as a high-value loot item. I mean, maybe you could try to jump scare and surprise them with it, but you could have killed that person 2 times over in the time it takes to disguise and wait for someone to interact with you as a chest. Chest disguises were also buggy and didn't unlock properly for players for months after they were introduced. Bear traps are similarly situationally useful, and when introduced, came with a game-breaking bug that allowed you to duplicate powerful weapons like cursed cannonballs or bone collars, making the Hourglass game mode, the on-demand PvP mode of the game, impossible to play for days. The prime use case for bear traps is to guard your ship's ladders against boarders, but often prove themselves to be a hindrance to the crew fighting on their own ship just as much to an enemy, as friendly crewmates can still set them off and be injured by them. The harpoon gun allows for easy traversal of the map and makes boarding an enemy ship easier provided you can aim it right. But you sacrifice one of your 2 weapon slots to a mobility tool that does no damage, making it gimmicky at best in most situations. And speaking of gimmicky, the blowpipe weapon is almost entirely useless in PvP combat, as it takes a long time to kill a target and presents as an awkward and impractical weapon with the default control scheme. The best use case for the blowpipe is to use it against skeletons and phantoms in the game controlled by the server, which players have already been fighting for years. Season 15 saw the expansion of the Hunter's Call faction, with only 3 new, extremely simple voyages at the time of writing to grind out the new level cap of 500. Out of the 3 of these voyages, only one, the Boar Hunt voyage, launched without any major bugs or exploits. The voyages introduced are repetitive, go-to-point ABC sailing simulators with no variety in what can happen for 500 levels of gameplay and extremely grindy commendations attached to them to sucker in the most dedicated players. The season also introduced 2 new Megalodon threats, both of which are extremely tanky and frustrating to fight against, and were introduced, say it with me, in a buggy state where they could flip and despawn your ship, or despawn even in active combat, making them extremely frustrating to fight against on release. Looking at the achievement stats for this season in particular demonstrates the lack of engagement from the core player base with the new Hunter's Call voyages, with only 2% of the player base on Steam or Xbox, which overlap in many cases, diluting the actual number of players, having completed 1 voyage for the Hunter's Call. Season 16, the season about to wrap up at the time of writing, introduced an expansion to the Reaper's Bones faction. A Bare Bones expansion with 2 new voyages, one of which was significantly delayed for no real reason. The main draw of the season was the introduction of the new Reaper's Bones Search for Ancient Secrets voyage, a reskin of 1 chapter of an already existing voyage from the rival company, Legend of the Veil. In keeping with the frustrating pattern of Rare, to complete the season's commendations fully, you have to repeat this voyage, which can take 30 minutes, 270 times. Good luck if you like being a completionist. The second voyage introduced was a simple X marks the spot map quest, of which there are over a dozen of in the game already. Even less people, less than 1%, have engaged with any of this season's content enough to get even a simple achievement on Steam or Xbox. Upcoming at the time of writing is Season 17, which brings us to the present day, and what is quite possibly the worst received season in the game's history, Smuggler's Tide. This season will introduce the Smugglers League, a faction with no lore significance who came out of nowhere to bring a reskin of a Merchant Alliance voyage which has been in the game for years. It is impossible to understate how fundamentally lazy and out of touch this is with a player base who is tired of reskin content and gimmicky so-called tools. And the community's reaction on social media has been intensely negative, almost universally so. It is worth noting that Sea of Thieves is Rare's only active revenue stream, and will be for quite some time, as Everwild, an adventure game they were developing for the past decade in parallel to Sea of Thieves, was just cancelled. This should be the time, facing layoffs and budget restructuring like the rest of Microsoft, Rare's parent company, to buckle down and introduce content that gets people excited to engage with and talk about the game in a positive way. But no, not even core community streamers are excited, the most front-facing promoted element of Sea of Thieves to the outside world. With a continually declining player base, the lowest active player amount we have seen in the game's history, lowering retention, especially with PS5 players, of which 90% have stopped playing the game actively, and players not interacting with new content, as is seen by diminishing, almost pitiful achievement stats for even the most basic achievements. The game looks like it has no future to be excited about, and from a long-time engaged player, that's heartbreaking. And if Rare can't decide to dial in on new, exciting content and listen to player feedback, my fear is that the Sea of Thieves will be shut down due to declining interest. And Rare, with no active IPs anymore and no revenue stream coming into Daddy Microsoft, will be forced to go the way of Raven Software, around in name only, working on whatever bigger IP they're told to, not allowed to engage with what brought them to prominence in the first place. I don't know what the future will bring to Sea of Thieves, but based on what's been happening in the recent past, it doesn't look bright.